Great. So good evening, everybody. Again, David here, Dr. David. I want to talk tonight about maybe a little more difficult topic, but about the dangers of being dishonest in recovery and the advantages of honesty, right? Both sides of the same coin. And I've kind of divided into three parts. One is, why do addicts lie so consistently? What are the dangers of that? And then how can we change those habits in recovery? But I want to talk a little bit about what goes on with lying in the first place, because I think it's confusing to people. It's confusing to the addicts because lying sort of evolves quite naturally and becomes sort of second nature. But we know that basically lying is due to a couple of things. One is fear of consequences. In many cases, I just don't want you to find out what I've done. And so I start to protect myself, keep secrets to hopefully avoid the painful consequences of my acting out behaviors, right? And I think also there's also another emotion that we often see that correlates with lying, and that's shame. And we know shame is a really primary emotion with sex and porn addicts. That's really the key feature almost. So if I am feeling a lot of shame, I may start the habit of lying because my feeling is, if you really knew what I was thinking or feeling or who I was attracted to or what I've done, you'd abandon me or have some negative outcome of some sort. And that's so I lie to protect myself again from that. So again, from consequences. The second thing is that lying is a habit. And it becomes so habitual that the addict themselves becomes kind of delusional about it. Sometimes, and you talk to many addicts, they don't know exactly what the truth is anymore because they've lied to themselves and other people so much it just has become a habit that becomes quite automatic. And the more we do it, the more likely we're to continue doing it. And so I think this is something that is painfully disruptive to any relationship, obviously, to the ability. We want to talk about integrity and honesty and recovery, and lying, of course, is going to undermine it. We also know that this carries on sometimes in recovery. Scott and I have talked about this in this webinar, where it's because of that habitual nature of it, people keep doing it, and they do it over stupid stuff. We talk about the story of the guy who was home from treatment, and his wife asked him if he'd taken the garbage out, and he hadn't, but he said, yeah, just to avoid some consequences. And then a few minutes later, she sees him taking the garbage out. That's a lie, and that caused a lot of problems. So I think just honesty, no matter what, is always the best policy in that regard. And I want to just repeat that the addict often does it without realizing it. This becomes so second nature, and that self-delusion takes place too. So that also contributes this. And then there's the issue of what we call white lies, right? What about, if we're working a program of rigorous honesty, can we tell our kid about Santa Claus? Or if somebody has a really terrible haircut, are we honest about that, or we just say it looks nice, or don't say anything? So those kind of white lies are confusing for people because they are more socially sanctioned. We know that in program, and we'll talk about this at the end of the tools for recovery, that the goal obviously is complete and rigorous honesty, and I think that has to be the objective. And there are cases where you have to, I guess, evaluate if it's going to do more harm, like in the case of telling your 7-year-old about Santa Claus. Then you have to, I think, consider it. But I think anytime we're up against one of those white lies, I, as a recovering addict for many decades, I don't trust myself even now. I really I consult, I get feedback from other people. Like, what would you do? What should I do? What do you think? Just so I'm not making that decision myself. I think that's a really important thing. So what are the dangers here? Lying in recovery becomes a really common relapse trigger. In this very webinar, all the time, we get questions from spouses that talk about my husband or my addict has started lying again, or has continued to lie, or has never stopped. Is this a bad sign? And yes, it is, because of that goal for really rigorous honesty is so important. And that also means that when we're lying, we're returning to our old and ineffective kind of coping skills, right? We're reverting back to older behaviors and older attitudes, and that's a real danger to the second one, which is becoming stuck. When we start lying in recovery, basically our progress stops, or at least significantly slows down. And so typically in the course of recovery, this happens when we hit some obstacle or belief or reality that is really hard for us to get past. This happens sometimes in the fourth step process, maybe sometimes in the amends process, but I think sometimes it's when people hit a roadblock, and they become more likely to kind of fall back to old patterns if they don't want to face what's in front of them. And so we really understand that progress can really be stopped or halted if that's the case. We hear this again all the time in this webinar. If friends and family find out about it, it has really devastating consequences. And we often hear from spouses, if where there's a slip, there's a little relapse, there's some problematic behavior, and the person is not honest about it to their spouse, at least initially. And we know the fallout, the more serious fallout, in fact, from the spouse point of view, is the dishonesty about the event. Sometimes, not that slippery behavior is in any way good, but it's really important for us to become honest about it as quickly as possible. And we recommend, of course, talking, if something happens, talk to your sponsor, talk to your peers, take action, get back on track, and then report fully to your spouse, and as soon as possible. But that's really, really important. So that dishonesty can really destroy any progress from your family and the healing. And it can then consequently can lead to guilt. Guilt and shame about what's happened again. And so it can really kind of set the addict back in terms of their own progress and affect their quality of life, their happiness, and all of that. And so that's really critically important. And then the final thing about lying and the price it takes is that dishonesty becomes pervasive again in our lives. And I think one of the things about early recovery is kind of shaking out everything and seeing, what is the truth here? What's the reality? Because I think we tell ourselves so much and so many different times in so many different ways, we don't really know what ends up. And if we continue this lying behavior, dishonesty in recovery, we're going to really revert back to some of those old unfortunate things. And finally, as a therapist, it's just so important for if you're seeing a therapist or therapy, be rigorously honest. You're wasting your money, you're wasting your time if you're not really being honest with your therapist. And again, I know this is extremely common. We hear this all the time, but boy, you're not doing anybody a service when you do that. Okay, so really quickly, what do we do? How do we increase honesty and recovery then? Well, how do we start to counteract this stuff? We have to admit, as I just mentioned, as soon as something happens, as soon as possible, we have to come clean, right? And this, is in the steps as the 10th step, but it also, I think, in a daily process of just whatever happens in our lives, the sooner we can come clean about it, the better. And I think that has to be the habit, that has to be the goal. We know that when addicts lie repeatedly, it becomes kind of automatic. The same thing can be true for the reverse. If we practice rigorous honesty, that starts to become more of a habit as well. It's like a muscle that gets worked and it becomes stronger. I think the more we are honest, the more we're rigorously honest, the stronger it gets and the more likely we are to continue that pattern. So I think just that it's a practice. You call it a spiritual practice if you want, but to be rigorously honest in terms of all our affairs. And that really is important. One of the things I found useful with clients is to keep a journal. If we don't have something written down, if we don't have kind of concrete, objective benchmarks, history, it's really easy to kind of fool ourselves and kind of forget things and gloss over things and kind of rewrite the past, because the past is kind of murky unless there's objective things written down to talk about it. And so journaling is a really important way, not only to process feelings, and journaling has all kinds of benefits therapeutically, but in this case, we're talking about just keeping a record of what you've done, what you've said, what's happened. And so that you can't kind of go back later and kind of fool yourself that maybe it wasn't as bad as I thought. Maybe it was, less harmful. Who really hurt anyway? The rationalizations that we give ourselves are quite incredible sometimes. And finally, that idea of being rigorously honest all the time, the issue of white lies, I think all of this is just important, where we have to still keep that goal of being honest in all our affairs. And then if there's an exception to that, as I say, I think it's really important to process that with somebody else, but then do what you need to do. But overall, we need to really, oh boy. Scott, are you still there? I lost my internet.
Yeah, no, you're good, and I can hear you.
Okay, my monitor's out, but
Okay.
So, but anyway, that's all I had to say. Oh, that was back. I'm pretty much done. Thank you.
Okay. So can you talk a little bit, and by the way, everybody, type your questions into the Q&A. We'll get to as many as we can. But I have a couple about the topic today. Um, with addicts, when we teach denial, we tell them that the lies and secrets start inside before they, we lie to ourselves first, and then it comes out of our mouth. And we keep secrets from ourselves first before we actively keep secrets from someone else. Can you discuss that this is kind of an inside job?
Yeah, and that's so true because I think there's many kind of levels of activity in our brains, and only a few of the top levels are conscious, right? And so we're often driven by drives, by core beliefs about ourselves. For example, I am unworthy, I'm unlovable, those are the negative ones. But oftentimes those aren't really conscious, but they guide and affect a lot of our behaviors. And so if I have a fear of abandonment that I'm not really even aware of, or it's not in the front of my mind, that may steer some of my behavior that starts to result in being dishonest with myself, with others. If I'm minimizing, nobody wants to see themselves as an addict, as you're kind of slipping over the edge there into the abyss. And I think we can really fool ourselves that, well, this isn't so bad, it's just a rough time. All those things we say, and you're absolutely right, it does start inside. And I think one of the things, and it's a powerful phenomenon. When we get folks into treatment, a lot of the first week is about breaking through some of the denial, and it's a weird thing because people can, there's layers, as I mentioned. People might have a cognitive understanding of what they've done and how they've hurt people and how it's impacted people, including themselves, but they're not in touch with the feelings of that, right? It's just an idea, it's a cognitive thought. And in treatment, to really break through the denial, you have to get down into the feeling zone here in our heart space and really connect with the pain and the sadness of what we have done, or the pain and sadness we've caused other people. And I think addicts inherently protect themselves from that pain, and rationalize and objectify and blame the partner and all that stuff that we do almost automatically in an effort to keep us from really seeing us. And I think when that happens, and we do that with treatment letters from partners and other kinds of confrontation, and the peers also contribute to that process, it's a painful awakening when people connect with, oh my God, and sometimes it happens over a couple of days, sometimes it happens all at once. But I think that is the breaking down of that system you're talking about, where we just bury stuff, and then sometimes it really, with a lot of pressure, has to be kind of, we wake up, and it comes to the surface. But it's very much an inside job in the beginning, exactly as you said.
And can you talk a little bit about how secrets are a form of lying, and how we keep secrets from ourselves too?
Yeah, so secrets are another kind of currency of addiction, right? Because we do things often that we don't want people to know about. We compartmentalize. We have many different stories from many different people. It's one of the things that cause a lot of addicts to kind of ultimately collapse under the weight of all these plates in the air and stories and lies and weights. But I think so lying is inherent to it. And I think that process of, as we're doing all this stuff to keep our addiction alive and really to protect the addiction, we're not really seeing the behavior for what it is. And this is how progression happens. This is how, even in the face of sex and porn addiction, which is really fast tolerance and escalation compared to some other addictions, where you think about porn, where people may escalate and the genres may go up into really, more kinky, taboo, whatever, even illegal. We often don't see that for what it is. We kind of just rationalize it and just somehow make sense of it in some kind of story in our brain. But I think that's a form of just lying to ourselves in a really dramatic way.
Yeah, I mean, I can remember early recovery. I had so many things closed up in little compartments in my mind that I struggled to tell the truth because, I didn't remember everything. I mean, on some level, I did remember everything, but on some other level, I was actively not letting myself remember things, which is compartmentalization. And this lives over here, and this lives over here, and this lives down here. And these things never meet or touch or interact. And it kept me safe in a way.
Right.
Because these were the painful things in my life that I was hiding from myself.
Right. And by the way, just say, most addicts have trauma or adverse experiences in their childhood, and that leads to compartmentalization. So before we ever pick up any addictive behaviors, we already are very good at compartmentalizing stuff. And so addiction comes along, it just fits right in. It's a perfect setup really for that process.
And we often compartmentalize early life trauma. I mean, people say, "Oh, my childhood was great," and then we start digging, and it's like, "No, your childhood wasn't."
Exactly. Oh, yeah.
We start compartmentalizing early to cope with things we can't cope with.
It's really life and death, to protect ourselves, from, emotional fear of abandonment or being unloved or worse, to cope with abuse, overt abuse of any kind. The one strategy a kid has, and it's not conscious, but kid has to deal with that, is to like, okay, I'm going to put this in a box over there and not think about it unless it's happening, so I can deal with other stuff. And that trains us early on how to, like, well, I can put that in that box. And I'll tell you where this also plays out. We're talking about kind of having awareness. We often hear guys that have done formal disclosures will, after the fact, will say, oh, I remembered, this and this and this, that they honestly hadn't tried to evade. It just, they'd kept it from themselves almost. It got buried and compartmentalized. And so they have to do some kind of amended disclosure to bring that out. But yeah, it's very definitely a process, and a long-term process of unveiling all that stuff.
Yeah. One last question for me. How long does it take the average addict to break the cycle of secrets and lies?
Wow, that's a great question. I've seen many different trends, I guess. I would say probably a year, maybe 2 years in some cases, but I think a good year. I'm trying to think back on my own recovery, and it took everything was just so automatic in terms of making excuses, or it just fell out of my mouth. And that took a long time to change, and a lot of effort, but I'd say maybe a year. I don't know, what's been your experience with that?
My experience was somewhere between year 1 and 2 is when I really started actively focusing on not lying and recognizing that keeping important secrets from somebody who ought to know them is a form of all that kind of stuff. And it was kind of coincided with step 4, where we look at our, and 4, 5, and 6, when we're looking at our character defects. And one of them was, oh, I lie a lot for no reason most of the time, to no end. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
And but I mean, recognizing it and fixing it was a process. So yeah, I mean,
and like all habits, I think, that are automatic, you have to fight that kind of automatic tendency and break it down to that point where you're right at the decision point of the fork in the road, right? You can go into the lie, or you can do some other more recovery, honest strategy. But it takes a while to figure out where is that point, because oftentimes we zoom right past it and we're in the lie before we even know it. And a lot of that process for me in my first year was figuring out when that was going to happen and doing something different instead.
Yeah. There's a book I know you've recommended called Atomic Habits. Is that something you would recommend for people who are trying to break the habit of lying?
Very much so. James Clear, I believe, is the author. And yeah, it's a really very current book with a lot of research-based stuff about how habits are formed, and more importantly, how to break habits. And so, yeah, he lays it out in very kind of 4 stages of that process. And it's a really readable book and very useful.
Okay. Let's jump into the Q&A here. So type your questions into the Q&A. Like I said, we'll get to as many as we can. My wife listens to these webinars with me and is really struck by talk of relapse and always having to be on edge and careful with the addict. It makes her not want to try and make it work. Can you give her any positives? So we do talk a lot about relapse. Is it inevitable? What does it mean when it happens? And can you give hope to betrayed partners out there?
Yeah. Relapse does happen. Slips happen. I mean, it's a reality. I think it would be dishonest to use the word of the night here for us not to address it. However, we've seen a lot of guys. We had the pleasure recently, and I was on one of the alumni meetings here, and we had several guys from one of our first clients, our first cohorts to go through, and this was over 3 years ago, and they're doing great. And so, yeah, we hear about the problem ones, and by the way, I think people that even if they're doing great now, they probably had a couple of bumpy patches in the beginning. And I think those bumpy patches are not that unusual. The important part is that I think rather than like totally going off the rails, we can take those bumpy parts, if you will, a slip, relapse even, and if we deal with it kind of therapeutically, we really analyze, look at what happened, what can I learn from it, and that also then increasingly makes it less inevitable, right? If we can learn from something, we don't have to make that same mistake again. So, and I understand how it can be distressing for partners to hear about this, but I guarantee you, if the person works the program and is really rigorously honest, and we see a lot of signs when there's that, maybe it's not happening, right? If there's blaming or lying or a lot of irritability and all that are bad signs. But those are signs of what? Not necessarily of relapse, although relapse may occur, but of the person not really engaging in their program of recovery. My belief, my personal experience, I know Scott's personal experience, if you really work the program in an honest and rigorous way, there will be a good outcome. And I think, and we see that a lot. We see people, and do people have trouble? Yes, of course they do. But I think this is a program that works, and there's been thousands of people that can attest to that. I personally know several couples in my own personal life that are long-term sex addiction recovery. I'm talking more than 10 years, and they're both couples I'm thinking of say that they're in a better place than they've ever been before, even before the addiction acted up. Means they're enough. So it works. It does work. And I think it's a matter of catching it early if somebody's starting to get a little wobbly, to kind of get them back on track and keep them going on track. But it all basically it's down to the addict, right? The addict working the program, doing it. And I know spouses, of course, get upset and kind of hyper vigilant about this, but ultimately it's not your responsibility either. And I know that's easy to say, right? I mean, if you're sitting there worried about it, but it's not. And if the person just does what they need to do, it'll work.
Yeah. And I will add that if you're an addict and you really want to stay sober, you need a much bigger support network than just your betrayed partner. Okay. Because if you're slippery and wobbly and your betrayed partner says, "Oh, David, you're slippery and wobbly today," David's going to be like, "Shut up." I mean, I don't mean it like that, but
no, I'm not.
Right, going to get
into a power struggle.
If I'm David's sponsor, I say, David, what's going on? You seem a little slippery and wobbly today. David's going to be like, "Oh, well, this happened and that happened, and I'm not sure what to," and suddenly we're going to get somewhere. Sometimes the betrayed partner is not the best person to give the nudge. It needs to be a fellow recovering addict or a therapist or somebody. So make sure, if you want your wife to feel better about your chances of recovery, get a big support network and make sure she's aware that you turn to these people, because that is the key to sobriety. At least for me, it was the key to sobriety. I needed a lot of people who would call me out on my crap, because there was a lot of crap. So.
And we knew this even in the original Big Book almost 100 years ago, talks about that power of kind of supportive groups. But now research shows in the last 10 years, a lot of research on how important that social connection is vital, in fact. And it's something that a lot of addicts don't do. We kind of keep to ourselves sometimes, often because of the disease. That's an old disease kind of mentality, I think, the addiction mentality. But boy, do we need that robust support network. Absolutely.
Yeah, keeping to ourselves is an old pattern. And, there's a saying in recovery, if nothing changes, nothing changes.
Right.
Which means we have to break old patterns. And one of them is clamming up every time we have a feeling. That's the surest way to relapse, is just have feelings and don't share them. You mentioned journaling earlier, David. What do I do when my wife looks at my journal without permission?
Okay. This is a really important point to talk about. We've had cases of guys that go through Seeking Integrity, and they work hard. It's an intensive program, and there's a lot of journaling, there's a lot of notebooks, there's a written timeline of all their behaviors, and all those are really critically important for the addict in their recovery process. They are meant to help the addict prepare for the formal disclosure, which should happen a couple months, usually typically several months after discharge. We've had a couple cases where a partner, I'm trying to think of a less judgmental word, but basically was snooping through drawers or whatever, and read the journal, read the notes, read the timeline that was prepared, which I think is a real betrayal. There is a right to privacy, even though the person is an addict, they're working on themselves. And I think what you're doing as a partner, if you do that, is kind of, and I think this, we know one of the strategies of partners is to kind of seek information, to get reassured in some way. They usually often just end up getting more upset or harmed. But it's, I would ask, just really, that's such a bad boundary crash. I would really ask the partners to respect the private journaling and documents of the addict, which, and remember, addicts by nature, one of the things we have to really work on is vulnerability and trust. I mean, people, this stuff, these feelings, these episodes in their lives, painful situations of abuse, and many of which are just being put together, just being remembered. Those are all fresh and kind of in process. And to have that being read is just a violation. I can't call it anything else. So I would ask everybody to honor those boundaries, and of course, the partner has a right to know, but it's important how that knowledge is conveyed. And we know from a lot of experience, the best way that should happen is in the disclosure process, where both parties are present, both parties have support with them in terms of therapists, and it's a very formal thing. It's not something to be met. It's the same, and just from the partner's point of view, it is upsetting. And I think we have situations sometimes where partners will press guys for information while they're in treatment, while they have their 30-minute phone privileges morning and night. And we explicitly ask our clients not to say anything, because what's happened in the past is that the client is sitting there with 24/7 staff and coverage and support, and they say this stuff at the urging of their partner on the phone, who is by themselves at home, sometimes thousands of miles away, with no support at that moment. And bad things have happened. We've had really bad situations, bad reactions from spouses. So there's a method to all this stuff we do. But in this case, to bring it back to this question, yeah, that's not cool. And whatever we need to do. In fact, right now we've started offering, if guys want to store their timeline or even their journals at Seeking Integrity until we can send them to maybe the therapist's office or somewhere else, that's an option. So just, that's how seriously we take this kind of thing.
Yeah. And an issue that came up in my sex addiction work group last night was, but how can I set about, this is my addicts that I work with, sex addict, how can I set a boundary? After everything I've done, how can I set a boundary for asking for some privacy, or asking, the situation was a guy who has agreed that, he will pick up the phone whenever his wife calls, but she now calls when she knows he's in meetings and things like that to test him, I guess. I don't know. And he's like, how can I set a boundary about this? But, journaling, the Sherlocking that betrayed partners naturally do. Or, as an addict, we feel like we don't deserve or have a right to set a boundary. How can we do that in a healthy way that doesn't feel like we're overstepping our bounds? No, it's a really great point, because I think it's probably universal of addicts in early recovery that they're very aware of the guilt, and they're very guilty and shameful of the things they've done. They're aware of that. And they're in the doghouse, to use a well-oiled phrase. And so many believe, they don't have the right to say that. And that extends too into even feeling happy, feeling joyous. A lot of guys feel, I don't have a right to even feel that. And so when I hear a lot of laughter at the house or in the office, that's a good thing, right? We need to laugh. I remember on my very first AA meetings, if I can indulge people for a moment, I was really resentful, because I walked into these big AA meetings and everybody's laughing and raucous. And I thought, I was offended. I thought, this is serious. This is my life. And I realized pretty quickly that we need to have all kinds of emotions about this, including laughter, which is a wonderfully healing release. So that said, I think we really need to practice in terms of setting boundaries. Now, setting those boundaries is probably going to be really awkward. It's not something that we're used to doing.
when we are new at asserting ourselves in some way, one, we have to get past, first of all, do I have the right to do this? And for certain boundaries, yes. And by the way, my message to most people in early recovery is suck it up, because you've done a lot of damage and you gotta give a lot, and just, if the benefit of that goes to the spouse in my book. However, there are certain things where boundaries are actually appropriate and are going to be helpful for the relationship. And so to create those boundaries, I would get help. Boundaries are not something that come in. We think they should come naturally, but we don't often do them very well. So if you have a safe therapist, I would help. And that's, by the way, what we ask the partners to do, to work with their therapists to set the boundaries for the addict. And it works both ways. And I think, yeah, we do need boundaries on both sides, because that's going to really save the relationship, I think.
Yeah, without healthy boundaries, relationships really struggle. And speaking in somebody's journal, whether they're a sex addict or not, is a boundary violation. And as David said, it's a betrayal in its own right, and it causes a lot of relationship strife, and rightfully so. Okay, my sex addict, porn addict partner is making progress, but has not achieved sobriety or honesty. I have accountability apps with monitors, nanny cams, an elevated level of intuition, and hypervigilance from hell. So I almost always find out within 12 hours, or I probably don't. I think my monitoring makes him think twice, but it also causes him to become more creative in his methods. How do we foster honesty when I often find out before he has the chance to admit to acting out? I don't feel safe to scale back on methods, but I realize if all this is slowing him down, or if all that is slowing him down is my monitoring, that's not safe either. So is a partner's Sherlocking, is what I'll call it. Does that slow recovery, or not? And then, what to do when you find out before he comes clean.
Right. It's really tricky, because I understand the need to kind of know, especially if you're intuitive and people are hypervigilant to signs, right, and symptoms, and so they kind of have a feeling, and that can happen. However, a couple of things are kind of inadvertently go with that territory. One is that in some ways the spouse is sort of starting to be responsible for the addict, because if you're kind of monitoring with nanny cams and so on, there's a kind of a power position there, and I see couples getting the power and control, dialogue and fights, actually, to power struggles, where people are monitoring everywhere, and the addict, as you say, becomes creative, and so there's a pushback, and so there can be a negative reaction. I think, as I said earlier, the partner has a right to know everything in a timely manner, but I think the effective process in this is for the addict to take it upon himself to see what happened, to correct the behavior, to process it with sponsors and peers, and then report back to the spouse of what I did. This is what happened. This is what I did. This is what I learned from it. The whole kind of a completed package. If you're confronting the person before they have a chance to go through that cycle, you're kind of short-circuiting that process. And so I guess I understand the urge to have the control and the monitoring, but I think I would ask you, despite the emotional discomfort it's causing you, to back off a little bit. I don't know if you're the recipient of the reports for the monitoring software, but we don't recommend that either. The monitoring reports should go to a sponsor, a therapist, or a peer, or somebody, but not the spouse. Because again, what does that do? It puts them in the place of being responsible somehow and controlling and being the policeman, and that's not a healthy thing for the relationship. So, I think it's a balance. It's a fine balance of monitoring, keeping good information, maintaining accountability, but also not stifling the whole process of recovery. And so I'd ask you, I think a better balance would be to maybe have less control and give the addict the time to come clean. And as I say, we have a rule of thumb, basically 24 hours is what that should be, if not sooner. But I think it allows the person to go through the whole process that we recommend in terms of doing kind of a postmortem, checking out with sponsors and so on, before that happens. So yeah, that's what I'd recommend. Scott, you have a lot of work in your work groups with this. What do you think of
Oh,
this?
yeah. Yeah. I mean, as far as addicts are concerned, tell the truth, tell the whole truth, not just the part she already knows, or the part she's not going to scream too much about, or, tell the whole truth, whether she asks for it or not, and tell it faster. Tell the truth, tell it faster. That's rigorous. What rigorous honesty is. A lot of couples, David mentioned 24 hours, have a boundary in place, which is if you come clean about a lie or a secret or something you've done within 24 hours, I won't get mad about the delay. I can still get mad about the lie or the secret or what you've done, but I won't get mad that it took you 23 hours, 59 minutes, and 47 seconds to get around to telling me. Now, the flip side of that is if it hits 24 hours plus, as a partner, now you get to bring it up, and now you get to be mad that he didn't come clean too, because most of the time betrayed partners are more upset by the secrets and lies than by what you actually did. So this is why rigorous honesty is actually a form of relationship healing. I slipped, I did this, I'm so sorry. Here's what I'm going to do differently in the future. And this is an important part of coming clean, by the way. Here are the steps I'm taking to make sure I don't do this again in the future. We're not perfect in recovery. It took me a couple of years to get actual long-term sobriety. Now, and I don't think I'm abnormal in that respect. I mean, a lot of people do it a lot faster, particularly if they're motivated by a partner. I was single, so I wasn't. But I was motivated to get recovery. I mean, my life was miserable, but I still struggled with this stuff. But I would probably set a boundary about the 24-hour grace period to come clean. And then I would also suggest, this is for betrayed partners. Buy this book, Michelle May's The Betrayal Bible. Get this book, read it. It's brilliant. It talks about all of this stuff. And one of the things Michelle talks about is, do you want to be his mom for the rest of your life? Do you want to be his mom or do you want to be his wife? And if you can only stay with him if you're being his mom, really? Is that healthy for you? So some of this Sherlocking, and Michelle also says, wait for full disclosure. And if you haven't had a full disclosure yet, and David mentioned disclosure earlier, definitely do it. Definitely therapeutically supervised. Different book, Courageous Love by Stephanie Carnes is the book to read for full disclosure. She runs through the soup to nuts process of therapeutic disclosure, another brilliant book. You get more creative in your Sherlocking. He gets more creative in avoiding. I'm not sure this is healthy for either of you. Some amount of monitoring is okay. But like David, I do not recommend partners be the accountability partner on Net Nanny or Covenant Eyes or whatever it is. It's just too triggering. What I said earlier about sometimes the betrayed partner is not the best one to give a nudge. I'm going to get defensive with my betrayed partner, whereas my support network of other recovering addicts, I'm going to be more open to listening to them, and that sucks for the betrayed partner. But it is the truth.
And those people can be more critical of that person, and the person's going to hear it in a different way than they might from their spouse. That corrective feedback.
Yeah. And again, betrayed partners, get this book. And if you're an addict, get this book too, so you'll know what your betrayed partner.
Michelle's really brilliant.
Yeah, she's amazing. Okay, next question here. How do you get your wife to start believing you again after so many years of lying?
It's a great question, and it's one that we hear a lot. We talk about kind of different time frames with the partner and the addict. That from the very beginning, really, we mentioned like roller coasters where somebody's up, somebody's down at any given moment. You're on different roller coasters, right? And this pattern that we've been talking about tonight of dishonesty and lying, and that's so automatic, so deeply grooved, if you will, in our brains, really is hard to break. And now, with effort, as we just said, it takes time, but it can be done. However, from the spouse point of view, after having the rug pulled out, maybe several times, right? They don't know quite what to believe, and they assume after a while everything is a lie, even when it's not. And I think this is one of the great frustrations of the addict, and it's in this question, like, how long is it going to take before my partner believes me? And frankly, it could take a while. I think the way I've seen it change, and what can maybe speed it up, is this process of transparency and what's going on. And if everything's just great all the time in your check-ins, that doesn't seem very real after a while. But if you're talking about your struggles and what triggered it, and what you did about it, and the process you took to not relapse, or the process you took to get back on track if there was a slip, that kind of transparency gives your partner a glimpse into the kind of the inner, machinery and thought process, and that is reassuring ultimately. And I think that is what really contributes to speed up this process of building some trust. But basically, I think it's just going to take time and a lot of communication between the two of you, and just checking in. And it's going to take rigorous honesty. It really is. We can't continue to do half lies, or not quite the full truth, or lies of omission. All that gets bundled together, and it just stops the progress. And so I think we have to be rigorous as addicts, and just be patient and take time and just do the next right thing. And our partners may get it, and eventually I've known some that never did, right? But it just is a process. But all we control as addicts in recovery is doing the best we can and being as honest as we can. And other people will believe us or not, but that's kind of what we have to do, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree totally. Dr. Rubb says usually about a year of rigorous honesty, she'll start to believe you again. And that seems like a long time, but in reality, it's not, because betrayed partners, when they find out you've cheated on them, that you've lied and kept secrets about something as important as sex, everything you've ever said or done comes into question. I mean, the whole relationship, I can't tell you, every week we get a question, is my whole relationship a lie? The answer is no. But I can see why you would question that. So it's going to take a while. And what you said, David, about talking about your struggles and what you did about them, and steps you're taking, it's very important. And guys are really, addicts are really resistant about that, because, well, if I tell my partner what I'm struggling with, my partner is going to get triggered, and it might make it difficult. I don't want to do that. It might set us back. And the answer is, yeah, your partner might react that way, but it's not going to, and it might set you back in the moment, but it's going to be one step back, two steps forward, instead of one step forward, two steps back. It really does help to rebuild trust. Most of the time when sex addicts do like a daily check-in with their partner, we always want them, there's a bunch of different forms, but always something should be, here's what I did well today, and here's what I've struggled with today. Should always be in that check-in, because life is not perfect. We do struggle. Sometimes we struggle with our addiction. Sometimes we just struggle. I woke up today on the wrong side of the bed, and I wanted to be somewhere else doing something else. And that was my whole morning, was just trying to stay on track. And then there's a support group that I go to in the mornings, right at the end of the morning. And I shared that, and the problem went away. As soon as it came out of my mouth, I was fine. As soon as I shared my struggle, I was fine. So yeah, you got to share about what you struggle with. I don't know, but any more thoughts on that, David? Or?
Well, I just finished a work group on intimacy skills from inner recovery. Yeah. We're talking about one of the essential features of building intimacy is communication. And because if we're not talking about what's going on in our inner process, and that's really what lets people know what our patterns are, how we approach problems, how we solve problems, and in our active addiction, I think the addict, at least my strategy, and I think most of the addicts I know, it's to avoid problems. We don't like tackle them head on. We don't even talk about them. We just kind of avoid them or deny them and put them under the rug. And I think that strategy, by not being honest and transparent, can be really harmful. So, and what you don't want to have is just where you're asking your partner to just take your word for it, with no other description or elaboration of how you got to that point. And given the history of betrayal, that's a tough sell, right? To just believe me. And so I think revealing that process, having a check-in, being honest on a good day, being honest on a bad day, all those things build trust in how I'm living my life and how I'm living my recovery. That is reassuring ultimately to the partner. It's still going to take time, but it's certainly going to help a lot to speed up that process.
Yeah. I love this next question. My husband has stopped SAA meetings after attending for about 2 weeks. He stated they're too triggering. Is this common, or is this another form of denial and resistance to recovery?
Well, I think when we walk into some meetings, it's certainly, sometimes they can be triggering. I think different meetings that are maybe well run are very conscious of language and things like that can be triggering. I know a lot of meth addicts have real trouble in certain Crystal Meth Anonymous meetings because just the whole gathering of all those people that of the kind they used to party with is triggering as well. So yeah, I've heard this before. I think, and Scott, I'd really value your opinion on this too. I tend to minimize the discomfort. Now, maybe that's a problem of mine, but I think a little bit this is kind of excuse, maybe is a strong word, but I understand that some people can be triggered by certain meetings. So I would recommend, if that's consistently happening, find another meeting. We don't give up on meetings. We don't give up on SAA or SLAA or SCA, whatever our fellowship is, just because we make it triggered. I think we have to stick it through and work it through. To me, as a therapist, that's great material to talk about. Okay, what exactly triggered you in that meeting? Why? What's going on? What does that say about you? What can we do? I mean, there's a wealth of things to work on in there, instead of just retreating from the meeting and saying it's too triggering. I think it's a little bit of a cop-out. So I think I would encourage, we can't do this without recovery groups. I'm a 12-step person, so is Scott. I think we believe strongly in the 12 steps. And then there's other ways, of course, but those are certainly the kinds we're most familiar with, and they work, but we have to attend, we have to go there. I don't think we can get our recovery in any decent shape without some kind of recovery group of other people, like-minded people. Scott, how about you? What do you think?
As sometimes happen, I have much stronger opinion on this than David does, or much stronger language. I think this is more than a little bit of a cop-out.
Okay.
I think this is a ridiculous cop-out. Yeah, I don't want to go to meetings, so I'm going to find a reason to not go to meetings. 12-step meetings work in part because we go to them and we get triggered in a safe setting, and we don't reward the trigger by, I'm an alcoholic as well as a sex addict. I go to an AA meeting. Somebody will say, oh, I walked down the liquor aisle at the grocery store and I saw my favorite brand of scotch. And you know what happens to me? I can taste my favorite brand of scotch. I'm triggered. I'm like literally tasting, I'm not going to say it, but, I'm tasting my scotch. I'm tasting my brand. But I'm in an AA meeting. I'm not drinking. I'll laugh and go, maybe when I share, I'll say, you know what, you mentioned the scotch and I was tasting my brand. And everybody laughs because they were too.
Right.
But we're all here for the same reason, to not drink. And none of us are going to the store. There's a liquor store right across the street from my meeting room, like literally right across the street. None of us are going over there and picking up a bottle after we leave the meeting. We're going to dinner together. We're going to home, whatever. We keep each other sober. And if I'm really triggered, I'll say, you know what, I am really triggered. Can somebody please go to coffee with me after the meeting?
Exactly.
And talk me off the ledge. And usually it's about 6 people who go to coffee. And we end up laughing and having a great time, which David mentioned. SAA meetings are the same. People will share about something, some behavior, some thought pattern, or there's somebody in the room who's attractive, or we get triggered, but we're all there for the same reason, which is to stay sober. And the huge part of recovery is learning how to deal with triggers in a healthy way. I need to be triggered so I can learn how to deal with my triggers in a healthy way. And the best place and safest place for that to happen is in therapy, 12-step recovery, and residential rehab.
So true.
Get your ass to a meeting, buddy. Sorry. Okay. There's my rant. But yeah, it's a total cop-out. So, okay, one more here. How much detail should I get into with the check-in? Another great question. So, check in with my spouse. How much detail?
It is a great question. First of all, let me just say check-ins are really important because for all kinds of reasons that we've elaborated tonight, I recommend daily, if not twice a day check-ins. There's all kinds of formats, Fanos and others, and they all call for slightly different things. I think you have to be, the only time I filter what I'm doing in a check-in is if something is potentially harmful, or if something I haven't disclosed yet, a feature that got triggered, or haven't had my formal disclosure. But I think the whole point of those check-ins is to be pretty rigorously honest, and I think it also builds a skill within the relationship between the two partners of like being able to speak my truth and have it be heard and received. And it also gives us a chance to practice reacting or not reacting and all the kind of interaction. So I recommend just being pretty honest. Again, the only time I would filter it, I think, would be if it's going to do some kind of harm in some way. And I can't even think of an example of what that might be. So I think I would hesitate to filter too much. The thing is, you don't want to make it a story. That Finos, for example, limits the time of check-in to very brief. And there's there's pluses and minuses to that. I think it can kind of keep the check-in a little superficial because it's so quick. But also, you don't want to go on. This is not, recounting your life story at the check-in, and so there's a fine balance there. But I, just in the interest of not wanting to or trying to be honest as possible, I would not try to filter too much. My own opinion. Scott, how about you on that one?
Yeah, I just popped a link to an article on couples check-ins in the chat feature. So check that out. It's got several versions of check-ins, one of which is Fanos, that's probably the most common. I think in early recovery, short check-ins are better. And even in later recovery, short check-ins, except on Tuesdays and Fridays when we do a longer check-in, and maybe have a different format for those days. Or if you have a couples therapist, that's the place for the longer check-ins.
Right.
Things like that. If issues come up during the week, save them for discussion for, Thursday afternoon couples therapy, things like that. Have some boundaries. We have a respectful conflict agreement on our website as well. Just type in respectful conflict, it'll come up. It talks about how to have difficult discussions, rules like, remember that we're allies, we're on the same team, let's fight the problem, not each other. It's okay to take a 15-minute timeout, things like that. No throwing things, no dirty language, not in front of the kids. You can, yeah, I mean, how much detail though? I mean, rigorous honesty means rigorous honesty.
Yeah.
Tell the truth, all the truth. But yeah, you don't have to go on for like 45 minutes and justify the truth, just tell the truth.
Right.
Get it over with.
I think of check-ins as kind of almost like present tense, like today stuff.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And if big issues get triggered, then I agree to kind of shelve them for the therapy office or for a longer discussion some other time. But you don't want to get hijacked in your check-in.
Yeah. We are out of questions. We're also pretty much out of time. So I think we'll break for the night. Anything you want to say to take us out, David, before we go?
Yeah, just saying we've kind of woven the topic of honesty and into a lot of the questions tonight, they're all kind of related. So I think we talked about it just to underscore the importance of honesty and how we can fool ourselves and be dishonest with ourselves without even knowing it. That's why other people in our lives are so important. So just really seeking that rigorous honesty as the goal always.
Thank you, everybody. We'll be back same time, same place next week. We'll see you then.
Okay, Scott, thank you. Take care.